Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. A few weeks ago now, the Old Peace update was released for Warframe, and for the most part, it's been great. I think the new modes are fun, I thought the quest was pretty good, Uriel is an incredibly powerful Warframe, there's a lot of high quality stuff packed into this update. I do have one sizable hangup though, which revolves around a new major system, the Tectilist artifact, and more specifically, the Tauron Strike. I'm a no-life loser, so I had all 5 artifacts done by day 4 of the update, and I have some opinions on the system. Before we dive into this subject, I want to make something clear up front. I know that this update just released and that things are subject to change, which is why I'm making this video in the first place. My vain hope is that a developer might see my feedback and consider it for changes to the system, or at the very least, that this video can get a discussion going about the topic. If you're watching this in the future, please do check the pinned comment for any updates. So, for those who are unfamiliar, Tauron Strikes are a new mechanic that expands on the game's focus system. They grant the player a powerful ability with a lengthy cooldown, in which they summon a school-specific Tectilist artifact for 2 purposes, an activation effect, and temporary effects that stick around after the cast. I want to talk about a few of the issues with the system as a whole, and then we'll get into the individual artifacts. First up, these things take an absurd amount of time to grind. To elaborate, each of the 3 Parita bosses drops a different currency, and you need 150 of each currency to unlock a Tectilist artifact. You get a baseline 10 currency per run, along with 1 currency per objective completion. I typically shoot for 9 objectives per run, but will be a bit generous and assume you can consistently hit 10. That's 20 currency per mission, requiring 8 missions to get enough for an artifact. On the Steel Path, non-boss Vanguard Warframes will drop 2 of a random currency on death, so I'm going to knock it down to 7 runs of each mission, assuming your luck is decent. Each mission lasts for a bare minimum of 12 minutes, and I'll again be generous and assume you can kill each boss in 1 minute. That makes 13 minutes per mission, which is 91 minutes per material, or 273 minutes in total. That shakes out to just over 4.5 hours for 1 weapon, and that's not even considering the focus and materials needed to upgrade that weapon. I'm also being fairly generous in my time estimation here. When I brought this up on stream, many of the people in my chat said they struggled to achieve 10 order completions, and killing the boss in a minute or less typically requires a specific loadout. For many people, this grind will probably be closer to 5 or 6 hours, again excluding upgrade requirements. Considering that each artifact requires about 5 million focus to max all of its upgrade nodes, and that you'll need about half a dozen more Parita runs and materials, and the investment required is pretty steep. Once you unlock the artifact, the first thing you'll probably notice is that you can mod it. Honestly, this is one of the main reasons to obtain a Tectilist artifact, as it grants a huge boost in operator power. Despite this being a very good feature that's been requested for ages, I do find that it has 2 noteworthy issues. The first is that very few of the mods actually affect the strike itself, instead mostly modding your operator and amp. Only the arcanes really affect the strike, and even then, 2 of the 5 don't require its use at all. Many people probably won't even find this to be a problem, but I do find it odd that modding the artifact doesn't really do much for the strike that it grants you. My second issue is that this system suffers from the same problem as the rest of the game's modding system. A ton of mods aren't that useful because they're competing with damage stats. You only get 5 mod slots in total, which makes the modding very competitive on these artifacts. Case in point, there are 4 mods that boost your amp's offensive stats. We have damage, critical chance and damage, fire rate and ammo efficiency, and one even adds multi-shot. Taking these off is an incredibly hard sell, as they make the operator much stronger, especially in the context of bosses like Eidolons. Now, I'm not saying you can't run other things, and I don't doubt that there are plenty of people who take other stats in their place. The issue I'm trying to highlight is that the opportunity cost of taking, for example, 60% operator jump height is incredibly high because it's in direct competition with damage stats. I use the 4 mods I just highlighted along with a Void Sling distance boost on every single artifact, and I don't really feel any incentive to run anything else because those stats are all just so good. My next major concern revolves around the mechanism by which you actually charge your strike, which is exceedingly confusing. Under normal conditions, kills by either the player or allies in affinity range grant a measly 0.02% Tauron Strike charge. Upon picking up a focus orb, however, the player gets 20% of their charge instantly, as well as a 5 times increase in charge rate for 45 seconds. If a player is at their focus cap for the day, then the orb will still spawn, but it will instead be blue to signal that it doesn't grant focus anymore. Speaking of focus, each lens equipped on your gear increases the charge rate, though not in a way that's intuitive. The game says that each lens you have equipped will boost your charge rate by 10%, and this boost takes effect regardless of the school or tier of lens that you use. So if you're, say, using Madurai, then Vazarin lenses will still contribute to this bonus, and there is no difference between a standard lens and a greater, Eidolon, or Lua lens when it comes to charge rate. There are, at the time of writing, 7 items that boost your Tauron Strike charge rate when they have a lens equipped: Warframe, Primary, Secondary, Melee, Amp, Heavy Weapon, and K-Drive, for some reason. So with all 7, you'd expect to have a 70% boost in charge rate, right? Well, as far as I can tell, it does, but the UI instead shows 41.2%. For some reason, instead of showing the 70% boost, the UI instead shows the percent reduction in total kills needed to charge the strike. I'll show the math on screen now for those who are curious, but I don't really know why they felt that this was the best way for the UI to communicate the difference. I find it exceedingly confusing that it's listed this way, and if it wasn't for my friend Aidan pointing it out, I never would have realized it was like this. Also, as you might have noticed from that math, it takes 5,000 kills to charge a strike with no orb buff. I know a lot of people don't really like the inclusion of the orbs in the Tauron Strike charging process, and while I don't mind it personally, you basically can't charge the strike without them. The 20% upfront charge you get when picking up an orb is basically the only way you're gonna get a significant amount of strike charge, and accidentally missing an orb pickup can set you back multiple minutes in terms of charge time. Lenses do boost the amount of charge you get for picking up an orb though, going from 20% to just over 30% with all 7, which is very useful. Honestly, the boost to orbs is the main reason I take the lenses, as it feels a lot more valuable than the kill bonus in my experience. I also want to quickly highlight that Tauron Strikes have improved charge mechanics in Purita. Each objective completion in the Purita Rebellion grants you 50% of your charge, and this is also boosted by lenses and focus orbs, so if you have an orb buff and you complete an objective, it'll fill your strike instantly. Entering a boss fight with a partially charged strike will grant you a full strike, and throughout the Purita boss fights, your Tauron Strike will also charge passively. Now, for a week or so after the update's release, Convergence orbs could actually spawn while you already had an orb buff. Picking up an orb while you had the buff from another orb would cause the 5 times increase in charge to apply to the picked up orb, granting you a full strike instantly. This only seemed to work in certain mission types, but it let you spam your strike very often. It seems like this was fixed at some point though, as orbs went from spawning every 30 to 45 seconds to instead every 60 to 90 seconds. Because of this fact, you'll only get a strike every 3 or 4 minutes in a mission, meaning that in a lot of missions, you won't even get to use the strike before the mission is over. You can kind of offset this with the initial charge mechanic, which gives you a flat amount of your charge up front whenever you start a mission or finish using a strike. The Zidon Ashir Arcane grants an 18% bonus, and the mod Empazu Shoal grants 12% initial charge, along with an additional 2% for each equipped mod that's from a unique focus school. These can typically get you a Tauron charge and 2 focus orb pickups, which lets you use it more often, but that's still 1 usage every 2 to 3 minutes, which in a game like Warframe is often half a mission's length or more. Personally, I wish that we would get to start the mission with a free Tauron Strike charge, just so that we'd get at least 1 guaranteed. The obfuscation of the charging mechanics leads me into my next major issue. The strikes don't really explain anything in detail. Take, for example, the Spectral Pages upgrade for Zenurik's Tauron Strike, Lorak. Its description reads, create 4 spectral pages granting 10% additional cast speed, ability strength, duration, and 100 bonus energy per page. That sounds simple, but there's some odd minutia to it. The way it actually works is that, after concluding your strike, 4 pages will orbit the player. When casting an ability, one of these pages will glow, and the benefits of that page will be provided for the next 100 energy worth of casts. All energy consumed will instead damage the page, and once a page is broken, it will disappear, requiring another ability cast to load up the next page. Almost none of this is actually explained in the description of the perk, and this is the case for several Tactilist upgrades. As an even more egregious example, the Tempered Venison perk for Unairu has an entire additional effect that the game doesn't mention anywhere, and the buff it provides you in mission has the wrong description. I've also been told that the strikes scale in damage with enemy level, and I've observed this behavior myself, but because you can't charge the strikes efficiently in the Simulacrum, I have no clue how it actually works. I've seen my damage go up from the Uvarium to the Circulus, but I don't know the specifics of how it scales at all. I don't even know what the base damage of any of the strikes is because the modding screen only shows the initial charge, charge rate, and temporary effect duration. All these other stats are for your operator and amp, not the strike. I know Warframe doesn't have a great track record of explaining things, but I find the lack of even basic stat transparency very frustrating. Hell, until the people on the wiki figured it out, I had no idea why my Zenurik pages were disappearing, and I don't think that's a situation I should find myself in. Real quick, I want to tack on a bit of a nitpick. The casting animation for each strike is really slow, typically taking about 5 or 6 seconds. This makes using them kind of a chore, as it's pretty often the case that you would have been more efficient if you just played normally. This is especially bad for Lorak and Vexoric, as the slow animation in conjunction with the spinning camera angles can be very disorienting. These two strikes actually have to be aimed, and by the time the animation finishes, your target's often moved, which makes them hard to reacquire on account of all the spinning. On Lorak especially, I really struggle to get my beam on target in time, which can be rather annoying. So, to summarize my issues with the system as a whole, strikes take a ton of time to grind, a lot of resources to max out, a long time to charge and cast, and they don't explain how things work a lot of the time. But much of this won't really matter if the strikes themselves are good, right? Well, that's my next problem. For the amount of time and effort these strikes take to unlock, upgrade, and charge, they often don't feel that impactful. This varies massively depending on the strike you're using, so let's go one by one. Do note that I'm talking about these strikes in the context of them being fully upgraded, so your experience may vary. Let's start with Lorak, the Grimoire of Zenurik. I'm starting with this artifact both because it was my first one, and because I have a lot to say about it. On cast, a tome is conjured, which fires a beam for about 3 seconds that damages and pierces enemies. Enemies damaged by this beam will always drop an energy orb if killed within 10 seconds. Or at least that's what it's supposed to do, but I think it's bugged right now, as it doesn't seem consistent. On top of that, the Prismatic Beam perk causes enemies hit by the beam to shoot smaller sub-lasers at nearby enemies. This provides decent crowd clear all things considered, but the laser itself doesn't deal great damage. Sure, you can fry an Acolyte or something with it, but try using it against a Vanguard member and you'll quickly realize how weak it is. My biggest gripe, honestly, is that the beam doesn't last for that long. Because of all the camera spinning, it's hard to even know where your targets are by the time the beam starts firing, and you don't have much time to actually use it. If the duration of the beam was increased to, say, 5 seconds, I think it would feel a lot better, while also distinguishing Lorak from the other 4 artifacts a bit more. Lorak also has a persistent effect called Spectral Pages, where once the ability ends, 4 pages begin orbiting the player. These pages grant a 10% boost in cast speed, strength, and duration, which are all additive with mods. This is increased by 40% with the Boundless Energy perk, granting a 50% total boost to strength, duration, and cast speed at max rank. Each page also grants 100 bonus energy, though the way this works is kinda weird. Basically, when you cast an ability, a page will light up, and for the next 100 energy of casts, that page's durability will be used instead of energy. An active page also grants the 50% strength, duration, and cast speed buff, and do note that having multiple pages does not stack this buff past 50%. After 100 energy of casts, the page breaks, requiring you to cast another ability to load up the next page, which continues until all of your pages are consumed. Whenever a page breaks, it's given to nearby allies, but only the free energy is applied, not the stat buffs. Now, I find tying the page's durability to energy spent to be really weird. Zenurik is a focus school that grants a ton of energy. Lorak itself even spawns a bunch of orbs, so it's pretty common to use base or even negative efficiency with this focus school. Because the page's durability is tied to energy spent, this punishes players who go this route, despite the focus school's value coming from enhancing your energy economy. I think that if this was changed to pages breaking after a certain number of casts, like say 5, it would make much more sense. I also don't understand why you need to cast an ability to load up the next page, and I feel like things would flow smoother if once a page breaks, the next one would become active immediately. So you might be wondering, why does breaking pages even matter in the first place? Well, that's because of the Brilliant Insight upgrade, which causes pages to shoot blinding lasers at enemies within 16 meters every 4 seconds or so. The less pages you have, the less lasers you'll be firing, and that kinda sucks because the lasers are pretty strong. If you want to actually use the lasers, you're incentivized to not cast your abilities at all, which goes against the point of even using Zenurik. My suggestion to remedy this is that, when a page breaks, it doesn't go away, but instead goes dark. Dark pages don't provide any stat buffs, but they will still shoot lasers, and they last until all 4 of your pages have been broken. To summarize my feelings on Lorak, the beam doesn't last very long, it doesn't deal great damage, the camera spinning makes it hard to aim, and the pages breaking based on energy consumed seems counterintuitive. I don't think it's unusably bad by any means, but the activation effect is fairly weak, and while the pages do provide valuable stats, they burn up pretty fast. Next up, we have Vexoric, the Sword of Naramon. This was my second Tectilist artifact, and funnily enough, it has the reverse problem compared to Lorak. Its activation effect is pretty strong, but the temporary effect is just not good at all. So, upon casting Vexoric, the Warframe will whip out their giant sword and swing it in front of them after a delay. Unlike Lorak, Vexoric actually gives you a couple seconds to aim, which is nice. Not like you can really miss with it though, as the hitbox of the wave it shoots is massive with the Astral Cut perk, and said wave also goes through terrain. The hit guarantees a slash proc on anything that survives, which on top of the high damage from the hit itself means that few things can tank a direct collision from Vexoric without bleeding out afterwards. Vexoric also grants 8 combo count for every enemy hit, which isn't really that good, but it's noteworthy, I guess. So the part where you whip it out and slash proc everything is actually quite strong, but that's offset by the fact that Vexoric has easily the worst temporary effect in the entire game. Meet the Spectral Blades, which are 4 copies of the equipped melee weapon that hover near both yourself and all allies in affinity range. These swords attack enemies within 10 meters whenever you land a melee hit, and hits from the Spectral Swords grant combo count and bonus Tauron Strike charge. The Flowing Strike perk increases this attack range to 26 meters, and Hungering Blades causes the swords to attack enemies a second time. Now, this all sounds good, and when I first talked about this weapon on stream, I even said as much. I would like to say that, for anybody who watched that stream, I take that shit back, and here's why. As far as I've noticed, these swords just don't scale well. I don't have a complete list of what works and what doesn't, but from my own testing, this is what I found. Damage mods work, elemental and status mods work, critical chance and damage mods work, and melee buffs like lethal levitation and furious javelin work. On the other end of the spectrum, attack speed mods don't work, mods that scale with combo count don't work, and melee stance multipliers don't work. As a result of these scaling oddities, these swords deal pathetic damage at steel path levels, and the Tauron charge they grant is just negligible. For a buff that I can only get every 3 or 4 minutes, these just aren't that good, especially because they only last for 30 seconds. I think this perk is really cool in concept, but in practice, it just struggles. I hope that at some point DE buffs them to actually consider the combo counter, alongside something like a 300 to 500% damage increase to mimic a stance multiplier. Hell, maybe the swords could even be given their own juiced up stats that aren't dependent on the equipped melee. I mean, they do only last for 30 seconds, and as we'll see with the upcoming strikes, these swords could insta-kill everything they touch and still not be that overpowered. Really, all you get out of this Tauron Strike is a room nuke every few minutes, which in a game like Warframe isn't much. To sum up my thoughts on Vexoric, the initial cast is quite strong despite the long windup, but the Spectral Blades are just really bad. If the blades scaled with combo count and stance multipliers, they'd be much better, and I think that giving them their own stats could also be a viable route for improvement. Next up is Cogron, the Hammer of Unairu. This strike is the first one I'd actually call good, but it provides a lot of its value from utility, not upfront damage. On cast, the Warframe equips the hammer, does a little spin move, and slams it into the ground. After a 1 second delay, the hammer will pulse out 4 rings of damage at roughly 1 second intervals. The range of these shockwaves isn't listed anywhere, because of course it isn't, but the Great Quake perk increases their radius by 40%. In my own experience, this hammer can cover entire rooms with its waves, which is pretty good. The damage of each wave isn't super high up front, but because there's 4 in total, it can still normally clear out rooms. Beyond damage, the Sundered Bounty perk causes Cogron to drop 5 pickups on each pulse, with these pickups being some arrangement of Universal Orbs and Universal Ammo. This means you'll get 20 pickups in total, which is surprisingly helpful as it can restock your ammo and energy quite fast. Even better, the Seismic Impact perk grants your next 4 aerial melee slams access to the Cogron shockwaves, which go off roughly 1 second after the slam connects to the ground. These slams will also spawn pickups like the main hammer does, doubling your total pickup count to 40. Because these are stored as charges with infinite duration, you can hold on to these slams for whenever you get low on resources, though do note that you can't hold more than 4 slam charges. The last perk I want to talk about is Tempered Benison, which causes shockwaves from both the hammer and Seismic Impact to drop 5 armor motes, which grant 450 armor each. The player can hold up to 5 motes at a time, and they're functionally identical to health conversion aside from the increased stat cap. Now, if you use Cogron with this perk unlocked, you'll notice that you receive a buff from Tempered Benison that's separate from the armor stacks. It shows a 25% icon and lasts for 30 seconds, but the description just mentions the armor motes. This is the weirdest and yet most valuable part of Cogron, which isn't explained anywhere in-game or even on the wiki. Tempered Benison grants you a 30-second buff, where any and all damage removes 25% of enemy defenses per hit. This means that Cogron's shockwaves will strip 25% of enemy armor and shields, which makes it much better at clearing rooms. On top of that, each hit of weapon multishot rolls the defense strip individually, so with enough multishot, armor and shields will be stripped instantly, even through Overguard. Most interestingly though, Warframe abilities will remove enemy defenses, which lets you do some wild stuff. For example, Gyre's lightning bolts from Rotor Swell can strip armor, which makes them much more powerful. The potential of abilities stripping armor is incredibly high, and the fact that this perk isn't listed anywhere is absolutely baffling. The existence of this effect alone makes Cogron so much better, but I had no idea that it even existed until Kronk messaged me on Discord and clued me in. Yeah, that Kronk. I guess he plays Warframe. Now, as much as I do love this perk, I do have to admit that 25% feels kinda low. We have several Helminth abilities that can remove enemy defenses much faster than this, so I don't see why Tempered Benison should only be 25% when it's on such a large cooldown. This may sound kind of radical, but I think this buff should be 100% defense removal instead of 25%. This wouldn't change its performance on weapons with high multishot that much, but it would make the Cogron waves and ability armor stripping much better, which would be a lot more fun. I also feel like the buff duration is kinda short, as it only lasts for 30 seconds, just like Spectral Blades. It is much better than Spectral Blades, so it's a bit more justified, but having 30 seconds of fun followed by 300 seconds of charging just kinda sucks. To summarize my thoughts on Cogron, it's pretty good. The radial damage is decent, the pickups it spawns are helpful, and the armor removal from Tempered Benison has a ton of potential. Despite that potential, 25% does feel kind of low for how infrequently this buff is usable, and I'd like to see it increase to something like 100%. Next up is Thara, the Bow of Madurai. I think this Tauron Strike is actually very good, and I want to break down why. The first thing that sets Thara apart is that, if you hold the ability key, you'll notice a targeting marker. This determines where the center of your barrage will be, and upon releasing the key, you'll fire an arrow into the targeting marker. After this, a blanket of arrows will rain down around the targeting area, lasting for 7 seconds at max rank. The game doesn't list the radius of this barrage, because of course it doesn't, but each arrow strike does guarantee both a blast proc and a puncture proc. The arrows also deal impressively high damage, making them quite capable of clearing out rooms and even taking out beefy targets like Vanguard frames. Even better, the Overwhelming Power perk grants 5% more power strength for each enemy hit by the barrage, up to a cap of 50%, with this buff lasting 30 seconds. This isn't crazy by itself, but it's a nice bump in strength for free, and it's incredibly easy to max. Now we get into Thara's most interesting temporary effect, Rain of Arrows. For 30 seconds after casting Thara, damaging an enemy will cause arrows to rain down on them from above, with a 0.35 second cooldown between barrage activations. The arrows from these barrages explode on contact, and this explosion can have its radius increased up to 5 meters with the Surging Storm perk. On top of this, the Downpour perk causes Rain of Arrows to target up to 4 enemies within 10 meters of the initial target. I don't know for sure how long a barrage from Rain of Arrows lasts, because, again, the game doesn't tell you, but this perk is remarkably good. Like Tempered Benison, this perk triggers from all damage, including Warframe abilities. This lets you do some really interesting stuff, like using Oberon's Carpets to cause widespread barrages, or using Uriel's Infernalis aura to strike enemies who get close to you. The arrows also deal really solid damage, so killing even armored targets isn't too much of a task for them. The potential of this strike is very high, with both the activation and temporary effect being really strong. Few enemies can survive the entirety of a Thara barrage, and Rain of Arrows lets you deal a lot of damage in a wide area. This strike has breathed a lot of new life into abilities like Hallowed Ground for me, and I really enjoy it for that reason. Really, the only bad thing I can say is the same thing I did with Cogron. The 30 seconds of fun just doesn't feel like that much. Sure, the effect is very potent, but the duration is so short that it feels like I have to slog through several minutes of charging for that brief boost in power. To summarize my thoughts on Thara, the strike itself deals remarkable damage in a huge area, and the temporary effect lets you use abilities in a whole new way. My only gripe is the short buff duration, but overall, this strike is very good. Lastly, let's talk about Nidri, the Staff of Vazarin. I think that this is the best Tauron Strike in the entire game, because it does something really special. Before we get into that though, let's explain how the staff works. So, on cast and after a brief windup, Nidri is slammed into the ground, dealing solid damage and pulling in nearby enemies. The radius is, again, not listed, but from my testing, it seems to be about 20 meters. This leaves a lingering zone for 30 seconds at base, or 40 seconds if the Swelling Deluge perk is unlocked. Enemies within this zone share 50% of the damage they take with all other enemies in the zone, which is a powerful effect. Now, I do want to say that this strike might be bugged, as it mentions leaving a lingering vortex, but only enemies hit by the initial cast actually get pulled in. Enemies who enter the radius after the fact still share damage and whatnot, but they aren't pulled towards the center, which may be unintentional considering the wording of the perks. This zone doesn't just cause enemies to share damage though, as the Rift Waters perk causes it to remove 25% of enemy overguard per second, and the Eroding Rapids perk causes enemies in the radius to have 100% status vulnerability. That's all quite good, but I do want to mention that the lingering radius is kinda small. I've noticed that ranged enemies will often post up right outside of the anti-Sea-Bear circle that Nidri leaves behind, which necessitates using Void Snare to actually bring them into the circle. It's by no means a deal breaker, but I do think it's noteworthy. Now, you might have noticed that I skipped over the final perk, and that's because it's the most interesting. Deathless Currents, our last perk for Nidri, heals all allies inside the zone for 250 HP per second. On top of that, allies in the radius of Nidri will be revived on cast, though they won't be revived if they go down in the lingering zone. Even more interesting though, is that this perk brings all dead allies back to life after casting Nidri. This even works in modes like EDA, ETA, and Arbitrations, which is super valuable. This perk alone is why I think Nidri is the best strike in the entire game. It does something that nothing else can do. I even made use of this effect on stream recently, bringing my boyfriend back to life after he died near the end of the tank boss fight in ETA, which was instrumental in us completing that run. Even removed from all of its other effects, which, mind you, are still very good, this perk alone makes Nidri very special and very powerful. A pocket insta-revive for your whole team, even through death, is a phenomenal support ability, and it makes Nidri fill a role that's irreplaceable. To summarize my thoughts on Nidri, the lingering zone is a little small, and it might be bugged at the moment, but it's incredibly good. It debuffs enemies inside the zone considerably, grants allies borderline immortality, and can save high-level runs from the brink through its squad revive mechanic. So that's a rundown of how all the strikes work, from the broad stroke stuff to the details. I've brought up potential buffs throughout this video, but considering the title, I want to take a moment now to make my suggestions for improvement clear. For one, I think these things should be easier to get. The investment required for each is frankly kind of absurd, and it's hard to recommend them when it takes so much time to obtain even one. My suggestion for this is twofold. The requirements for each strike should be 100 of each resource, and the Steel Path mission should have the resource drops boosted by 50%, so 15 materials at base and 2 per objective completion. I think that this would make the grind substantially less taxing, and as a result, more players would get to enjoy the unique benefits of each strike. I also think that these strikes charge way too slowly, as even the best strikes rarely justify the long cooldown. We're so powerful in Warframe that I don't think anything could really justify a 3 to 4 minute wait time, so if we were able to charge a strike in, say, 1 to 2 minutes, I think they'd feel much better. Honestly, the charge time is my main issue with this system, and I think that everything else would flow more nicely if this change alone was made. I know a lot of people also really don't like that the charging is tied to focus orbs, and while I don't personally mind it, it does feel like the orbs are the only way to actually get your strike. Making the strikes passively charge at a slower rate, or maybe increasing the charge from kills without an orb buff, would hopefully help to smooth this issue over. The strikes also take a very long time to cast, which often means that whatever you were targeting has moved or died, so I would like a way to speed up the casting for these abilities as well. I also think that the information problem deserves to be rectified, as many abilities don't mention key stats like range or damage. I'd also like solid numbers on how these things scale, as the damage does certainly change with level, but I don't know the underlying mechanism for that. I also think that, in a future expansion to the system, it could be cool to get mods for the artifacts that actually affect their stats directly. To that end, I'd love to see more mod slots added for each artifact, as the current 5 makes it hard to slot things that aren't damage. On to the individual strikes. My main issues are with Lorak and Vexoric. For Lorak, I think the Beam at Fire should last for longer, and I think that spectral pages should be consumed based on number of casts instead of energy cost. I also think pages should become active instantly upon the prior page breaking, as opposed to requiring an ability to be cast. Lastly, I think pages going dark and still firing lasers after being consumed would be a nice way to let players use their abilities without it feeling like the system is punishing them. For Vexoric, the spectral blades are very weak, and I think they'd be much more worth it if they scaled with things like combo count mods. I'd also like to see a boost in damage up front, like say 3 to 500%, to mimic the power of a stance multiplier. Cogron is a strong pick as is, but I think that Tempered Benison needs to be updated to clarify that its lingering armor strip even exists, let alone how it works. I also think it should be buffed to 100% defense strip per hit to make both the Cogron waves and ability damage more powerful and interesting. I also think that Nidri might be bugged, and it's possible that it's supposed to pull in enemies for its entire duration, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Really, most of my issues beyond Lorak and Vexoric is that the temporary effects don't last for very long, but I think that a sped up charge rate would be the best way to eliminate that issue. Getting to use a 30-second buff every 90 seconds or so feels much better than the current 3 to 4 minutes, as I experienced myself back when you could chain focus orbs together. My goal with this video has been twofold: explain how the strikes actually work, and provide feedback to the devs on how they could be improved. I don't honestly expect any developers to see this, and I don't doubt that my feedback and ideas have their flaws, but my hope is that this can get a discussion going that leads to positive change. I think the Tauron Strikes are super fun in concept, and with a little bit of polish, they could be a much more viable part of the moment-to-moment gameplay of Warframe. Alright, that's all for today's video. Thank you so much if you made it this far, and let me know your thoughts on the Tauron Strike system in the comments. Do you like it as is? Do you think my changes aren't going far enough? I'd love to hear what you think, just please keep it civil. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you left a like, and if you want to see more garbage, then you're welcome to subscribe. If you think my takes are ass and that I should be boiled alive, then I guess you can leave a dislike too. I also have a Discord you can join if you want to experience a digital lobotomy, and I have plenty of other videos on this channel that you might enjoy. Lastly, I want to thank my YouTube members for making this content possible. This channel would not exist without you. With all of that out of the way, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.